He paid her to sweep his floors and left the coins on the table without a word. By dusk, she was gone again, vanishing into the tree line like she had never been there at all. But the evening he decided to follow her, just out of restless curiosity. He found something that bent his quiet world in half and forced him to see the kind of survival he had never known. The first time he noticed her was because she said nothing. Not when he handed her a pail. Not when he pointed toward the stack of wood he needed chopped small enough for the stove. Not even when she bent on her knees to scrub coyote tracks from his porch after a winter storm had driven the half-dead animal up from the ravine. She worked like she had no choice. Like motion itself was the only thing keeping her upright. Her hair was tied back with twine, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her dress patched in places more stitch than cloth. Her boots were too thin for the mud, but they carried her steady across every floorboard. He thought she might not last a day. She looked young, late 20s at most, though her eyes carried a weight older than that. She didn't flinch when the wind rattled the shutters, or when the axe bit too deep in the wood. She only kept moving. Silent, exact, almost invisible. He gave her a coin when she was done, expecting her to glance at it, maybe count, maybe linger long enough to ask about more work. She didn't. She only wiped her hands against her apron, nodded once, and stepped out into the dusk. No horse waited, no wagon, no man to take her arm. She walked back toward the ridge, her small frame swallowed by the timber. By the time the last light drained from the sky, she was gone. Eli thought of her afterward, though he told himself he didn't. He had been widowed for 5 years, a cattle runner once, now a man who measured land for other men richer than him, living alone in a cabin 3 miles from the valley. He kept to himself. It was easier that way. But 3 weeks later, she returned. Same hour, same silence, same steady labor. This time, when Eli turned from the window, the coin still sat untouched on his table. By the 4th visit, he began to watch her differently. Not like someone who worked for him, but like someone who had learned too young that the world gave nothing freely. By the 5th, he finally knew her name. Not spoken, never spoken, but stitched in careful letters on the strap of a worn satchel. Myra Jansen. He had not meant to follow her that evening. Truth be told, Eli Mercer was not a man who made habits of chasing after anyone. His life, for 5 long years since the death of his wife, had been lived like a straight road. No diversions, no lingering at crossroads. A cabin 3 miles outside Ren Valley, a horse he trusted, a few tools from the cattle days, and work that came irregularly but paid honest. That was his world, small, steady, and safe. But that night, as dusk pressed its weight on the hills, Eli found himself standing on his porch, watching the slim figure of the cleaning woman slip into the line of trees at the edge of his clearing. She had come, same as always, worked without a word, taken nothing but the broom and bucket he gave her. Then, like smoke rising and vanishing, she was gone again. Every time she left, she disappeared into those woods as though she had been swallowed whole. Something in him shifted that evening. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. He told himself he was only checking the north fence, that his horse needed a stretch before the freeze set in. But even as he saddled the mare, his eyes kept searching the dark where she had vanished. She did not look back. She never did. There was no road she followed, no wagon trail. Just a narrow, clawing cut of brush where no man would have guessed a path ran. Eli guided his horse until the trees thickened too much, then dismounted, leading her by the reins. The trail was sharp and tight, the kind of passage worn only by repeated feet, not by wheels or hooves, and the whole time he told himself he could turn back whenever he chose. He never did. By the time he crested the last ridge, the light was almost gone. The valley below was not much of a valley at all, more of a scar in the earth where miners once cut deep and left ruins behind. In that hollow, tucked beneath the leaning remains of a shed, was something that should not have been called a home. A hovel at best, Its roof was patched with tarps weighted down by stones. A crooked chimney exhaled smoke like a sick man taking his final breath. At first, Eli thought it empty. Then he saw movement. Not hers, not at first. Children. 5 of them. The oldest boy looked no more than 10, thin as fence posts, his shoulders already bent like he bore too much weight for his age. A little girl, perhaps 9, carried wood in her arms, stacked nearly higher than her chin. 2 smaller boys darted near the edge of a stream, filling battered pails with water that iced around the rims. And the youngest, just a toddler, stumbled, barefoot through the dirt, his cry splitting the air as he tripped over a root. Eli froze. Myra, he finally knew her name from the satchel stitched with neat letters, rushed out then. Barefoot as well, hair loose, her hands quick as she scooped the child up. She cooed words too soft for Eli to catch, kissed the boy's brow, and carried him inside. The other children did not stop. They worked like soldiers, silent, practiced. Each motion precise, no complaint, no wasted breath, only survival. He stood watching far too long, the cold pressing through his coat, his breath clouding the air. He had seen hardship in his life. Men broken by debt, families ruined by drought, children starved by winters that stretched too cruelly. But this was not ruin. It was persistence, growing like weeds in the cracks of stone. Life refusing to yield. Eli left before they could see him. His boots crunched softly on frozen leaves as he retraced his steps up the ridge, back toward the safety of his own walls. He did not speak a word, even to the horse, but something inside him spoke all the same, a weight that made his chest ache. The next morning, he nailed a sack of flour to her doorframe. He did not wait for thanks, did not stay to explain. He simply left it, then rode on before the frost had melted from the ground. A week later, when he passed by again, the sack was gone. Nothing said, nothing written. But she came back to his cabin soon after, worked the same way as always, left, the coin he had given untouched on the table. That day before she left, she paused at the door, just for a moment. Her hand brushed the frame, her head turned slightly, almost as if she might speak, but she did not. She vanished into the woods again. By the end of that month, Eli had stopped pretending he wasn't watching the trail. He began leaving more than coins on the table, biscuits wrapped in cloth, a jar of honey, little things, small things, but enough to say what words never did. And she never took more than one. Once, she left a note instead. Please stop. Just that, not angry, not pleading. Just final, but he couldn't stop, not truly. And when the boy came to his door, 10 years old, soot-streaked, clutching a basket of eggs and a scrap of paper that read simply, "For the help," Eli felt something in his life begin to turn, because kindness had been answered, not with thanks, but with pride. And Eli Mercer knew then this wasn't charity anymore. This was something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. Snow came hard that winter, the kind that silenced everything but the creak of pines and the moan of wind across the ridges. Eli Mercer sat up nights by his fire, staring at the door like it might open on its own. Myra hadn't come for 2 days. Then 3. By the 4th morning, he was already saddling his horse before the sun had cleared the peaks. He told himself he had no reason to ride out. But when a man tries too hard to excuse himself, it means he already knows the truth. Path into the hollow was half buried, snow pressed deep enough to swallow boot prints. Eli's horse stumbled more than once as they made their way down, breath steaming in the bitter air. When he reached the ridge above the hovel, the sight below froze him. The roof had collapsed under the weight of ice. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. The small clearing, once alive with motion, looked like a graveyard. He dismounted quickly, boots crunching through crusted snow as he descended. At the door he paused, listening. A sound reached him. Faint, but there. A cough. A child's whimper. He pushed inside. The walls leaned dangerously, the patched roof sagging. But the children were still there, huddled together beneath quilts, their eyes wide, watchful, but alive. "Myra," he called softly. No answer. A small girl, 7, maybe 8, looked up at him. Her hands clutched a ragged doll, missing one arm. Her voice was barely a whisper. Mama went for help. When? Eli crouched low, meeting her eyes. The older boy stepped forward then, thin frame rigid with protective defiance. "Yesterday," he said. "Said she'd be back by night." Eli didn't wait. He turned, sprinted back to his horse, and urged it down the narrow trail. He searched every cut, every ridge, eyes burning against the snow glare. It was near dusk when he found her. She lay half-buried beneath a fallen pine, her leg twisted, her arm bent wrong. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. Blood had stiffened the sleeve of her dress, but her eyes fluttered open as he lifted the branches away. "I was coming back," she murmured, her voice thin as paper. Eli said nothing. He simply lifted her, cradling her against his chest like she weighed no more than the child she had carried, and set her gently across the saddle. He rode hard for the cabin, each jolt of the horse pulling a grimace from her, but not a sound. By the time he pushed open his own door, darkness had fallen. The children gasped when they saw her, pale and limp. Eli had brought them too, bundled, into a cart he'd dragged from the hovel, wrapped in quilts and coats, silent with fear. They crowded near the fire as Eli laid Myra in his bed. For the first time since his wife had died 5 years ago, another soul lay upon those sheets. It would not be the last. The snow trapped them for 3 more days. Each morning Eli rose before dawn to stoke the fire, careful not to let the cabin lose its meager warmth. He boiled oats when he had them, water when he didn't. Anything to keep their bellies from emptying too fast. Myra drifted between fever and silence, her arm splinted with kindling tied in place by one of his old shirts. The children did not ask questions. They simply moved around him like shadows, solemn, soft-footed, watchful. The oldest boy, Nathan, he learned, was already half a man in the way he spoke and carried himself. He rarely left Myra's side, except to fetch wood or hush the little ones when they whimpered. Lisa, the girl with the needle-sharp eyes, portioned bread into careful strips and kept her siblings close whenever the door opened. Ben, the gap-toothed boy of 7, carried a slingshot even inside as though a threat might step through the cabin walls. Tommy, skittish and quiet at 5, clung to Lisa's skirt. And Clara, the baby at 3, slept with her thumb in her mouth and her fist tangled in her sister's quilt. They filled the space Eli hadn't realized was empty. The floor creaked. More, the fire burned faster. The air grew warmer, thicker. But it wasn't the noise that unsettled him. It was the gratitude. Unspoken. Constant. Nathan's nod when Eli handed him a plate. Lisa folding his shirts after drying them. Clara offering him her broken doll in exchange for a warm mug of tea. They were children who had learned to pay for kindness, even when it was freely given. Eli did not ask about their father. He didn't need to. The answers were written in the bruises on Myra's ribs, in the way the children flinched when boots hit the porch, in how Myra's eyes darted to count them first each time she stirred from fever. He knew the kind of man who had left marks. Like those. He had seen enough of them in his years. On the 4th day, she finally sat up on her own. Her lips were cracked, her face pale, but her voice was steady. "I told you not to follow me," she said. Eli, kneeling as he checked her bandage, did not look up. "You told me a lot of things without saying a word." Her gaze sharpened. "You should have left us there." "I did," Eli replied quietly. "Once." She did not answer. She only leaned back against the headboard, eyes closed, her breath uneven. The fire cracked between them, filling the silence where too many words pressed but none were spoken. The snow eased at last, but the silence it left behind pressed heavier than the storm itself. Eli Mercer was not a man used to company, yet the cabin seemed to breathe with more life than his solitary years had ever allowed. The children moved, like shadows, quick, deliberate, efficient. Myra lingered in a haze of recovery, her broken arm bound, her leg weak but steadying. And Eli, he found himself watching them, not with pity, but with something harder to name. Nathan, the eldest, carried himself with the weight of a man twice his years. He sharpened kindling, tended the fire, and kept a quiet watch on the others. Eli caught him once sitting on the porch long after dusk, his small frame wrapped in one of Eli's coats, eyes locked on the dark ridge like he was waiting for something to appear. Eli joined him without words. They sat together until the boy finally spoke. "She doesn't sleep much," Nathan said. Eli nodded. "She gets up when she thinks we're out, checks our shoes, our coats, makes sure we got enough food packed. She always thinks she's going to have to run again." Eli turned, surprised at the calm in the boy's voice. "You ever ask her why?" Nathan shook his head. "Didn't have to." They said nothing more, but something shifted between them. The boy stood taller the next day, and Eli stopped expecting gratitude. That week, Eli hitched his old mule to the broken sled behind the barn, repaired the runners, and hauled back supplies from Ren Valley. 2 sacks of flour, a half-cured ham, salt, and beans. When the shopkeeper asked what a solitary man needed, with so much, Eli lied with the ease of a man who had learned long ago when silence was safer. "Distant cousins," he said, then left before more questions could come. When he returned, Myra was awake, sitting near the fire with Clara in her lap, her hair damp from a wash. She looked at the goods he laid on the table but said nothing. Only after a long pause did she murmur, "You're not obligated." "Neither are you," Eli answered. And that was that. It wasn't a decision. No vows spoken, no promises carved in stone, just a series of quiet choices. Myra stopped leaving. After supper, the children unpacked their meager belongings into corners of the loft. Ben asked if he could sleep beneath the rafters. Lisa began keeping track of meals with the precision of a quartermaster. Nathan offered to help mend the chicken coop. And Myra, without announcement, began stitching the seams of Eli's shirts at night. Eli, without realizing it, started to expect the sound of small footsteps in the morning. But peace in places like Ren Valley never held. Not for long. The first sign came not with thunder or violence, but with a rider, a woman. She appeared midday, lean and sharp-faced, her hair drawn so tightly it looked like it hurt. She dismounted. Stiffly, her boots dusted, her eyes full of disapproval. "You seen Myra Jansen?" she demanded. Eli leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. "Who's asking?" "Her husband's cousin." The words were too quick, too clean. Eli didn't flinch. "That's so. She's taken something that don't belong to her. Ran off with the children. Man's beside himself looking." He let silence stretch until the woman's eyes narrowed. "You hiding her?" she asked flatly. "Lady," Eli said, his voice low, steady. "If I was, I wouldn't tell you." The woman scowled, yanked her reins, and left in a huff. Eli watched her until she disappeared into the tree line, then saddled his horse the next morning to ride. The long route through the hills, scanning for tracks, listening for hooves. He told Myra what had happened that night. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She only pulled her children close, whispered something soft in a tongue Eli didn't recognize, and held them longer than usual. The next day, Eli built a hidden latch on the trapdoor of the pantry, covering it with boards, just in case. But for a time, things settled again. Spring shook off the last of winter's frost. Myra moved with more ease, her arms still stiff but functional. She planted herbs behind the cabin, coaxing life from the thawing soil. The children laughed louder. Clara called Eli Papa by accident. The word caught in the air like a spark. Myra froze, her face pale, but Eli only smiled and brushed the child's hair. Still, beneath the warmth, Eli felt it. The shadow of something unfinished, like a storm circling just beyond sight. And it came on a Tuesday. Eli was mending the west fence with Nathan and Ben when they saw him. A rider. Dark coat, black horse. The kind of man who carried himself like trouble was an old friend. Eli told the boys to stay back, then stepped out onto the trail as the rider slowed. "You Mercer?" the man asked. "I am. I'm looking for Myra Jansen." "What for?" "She's mine," the man said, calm as water. "Took my kids, took my name. Think she can disappear." Eli felt something twist cold in his chest. "She's not yours," he said. The man dismounted slowly, unhurried, confident. "She will be." And then, without warning, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. She was always good at making men think they were saving her. "You'll see." Eli didn't answer, didn't move. But that night he slept with his boots on, kept a lantern low, and when he heard Myra's footsteps in the hall, saw her shadow pause near the doorway, he knew she had heard every word. The wind shifted by morning. The air carried a weight Eli recognized from his cattle days. Something was coming. Eli Mercer had not kept a dog in years, not since the cattle days, when a good dog meant the difference between a quiet night and a slaughtered herd. He hadn't needed one out here, not until now. But when Nathan came back from the northern ridge with a half-starved mutt trailing him, ribs sharp, eyes wary, Eli didn't ask questions. He just nodded once. "We'll call him Scout." The dog proved himself quick, alert, quiet, smart enough to save his bark for when it mattered. He took to sleeping near the porch steps, ears pricked, nose testing the wind. Lisa brushed his coat in the evenings, careful and gentle. Ben fed him scraps from supper and declared him their protector. But it wasn't Scout that made Eli feel safer. It was the way Myra looked at him, like something inside her, something long clenched, had finally loosened. She was changing, not into someone else, but back into herself. Her spine straightened when she walked. Her eyes softened when the children laughed. Sometimes Eli caught her humming as she folded clothes, a faint tune barely louder than the crackle of firewood. She still didn't speak much, but when she did, her words carried weight. "Your fence is weak on the eastern side," she said one morning, as Eli saddled his horse. He turned, surprised. "I thought you didn't care for the animals." "I care about breakfast," she answered simply. And that was that. The children were thriving, too. Nathan even laughed once, a sharp, short bark of a sound. Myra's head whipped around at the noise, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Lisa started drawing careful little patterns in the dirt, tiny designs for gardens she wanted to plant. Ben kept practicing with his slingshot, aiming at fence posts with a soldier's determination. Tommy, still skittish, began trailing Eli whenever he worked outside, mimicking his movements with a small stick like it was a hammer. Clara, bright-eyed Clara, started sleeping through the night without waking in tears. Yet Eli noticed something else as well. Myra grew quieter, but in a different way. Not afraid, not guarded, just distant, thoughtful. She was planning. Eli recognized the signs. He had once prepared to leave everything he owned behind, and he knew how people looked when they started weighing their lives against what they could carry. One night, he heard her crying. Not loud, not broken. Just a trembling, muffled grief behind the bedroom door. Eli didn't enter. He sat near the fire, his back against the wall, Scout curled at his feet. He stayed awake the whole night, listening to the quiet sound of her sorrow. At dawn, he found her kneeling by the creek, her hands folded in her lap, her hair braided tight. She looked up when he approached but didn't move. He sat beside her on the frozen ground, silent. "I thought about leaving," she said at last, her voice low. "Taking them and going west." Eli stared at the stream. Why didn't you? Her eyes flicked toward him. Because you'd follow. I would. She nodded once. And I'm tired of running. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It carried weight, yes, but not the weight of fear, of understanding. She picked up a stone, smooth and pale, turned it in her hand, then set it gently in the current and watched it vanish downstream. That man, she whispered, the one who came asking for me. His name is Roland Jansen. My husband by law, not by choice. He wasn't always cruel, just proud. The kind of pride that rots if left too long. He didn't want a wife. He wanted obedience. I gave it for a time. I gave him children. That's when it got worse. Her voice stayed steady, but her fingers dug into her skirt. He'd leave for days, come back angrier. I never asked where he went. I only asked that he leave the children out of it. She looked at Eli then, eyes hard as stone. He didn't. Eli's jaw tightened. I took them one night while he was gone, she continued. Left a note. Prayed he'd never find us. But men like him don't let go of what they think they own. You're not his anymore, Eli said, his voice quiet but sure. For a long moment, she just studied him. Then she nodded. I'm not. They walked back together, the children already stirring. Lisa handed Myra a cup of tea without asking where she'd been. Nathan was showing Ben how to tie knots. Clara had drawn a picture in the dirt, a cabin with 6 figures outside it, one holding a stick, another holding a loaf of bread. Myra smiled at it for a long time before brushing the dirt smooth with her hand. Eli didn't tell her what he had seen 2 nights earlier. Roland, standing beyond the ridge, watching from the trees. He hadn't said a word, hadn't needed to. The crushed cigarette butt left behind told enough. Eli had tracked the print of his boot through the mud until it vanished into the pines. He hadn't told her because fear could break the fragile peace they had built, but he knew time was short, and so he prepared. He checked the locks on the doors, reinforced the shutters, dug a trench behind the barn. He taught Nathan how to signal with smoke if ever a rider came, told the children. It was a game. Told himself it was only caution. But Myra knew. He caught her watching him one night as he double-checked the bolt on the front door. Her eyes were steady. Not panic, not dread, just the weary acceptance of a woman who had lived too long with uncertainty. You think he's close? She asked quietly. Eli looked out into the dark. I know he is. She didn't flinch. Didn't accuse him of keeping it from her. She simply picked up the rifle leaning near the door, checked the chamber, and set it back down with a final click. I won't run again, she said. You won't have to. The next morning brought no snow, no storm, just silence that didn't feel like peace. Scout circled the cabin with his ears flat, growling low at the tree line. Eli checked the barn, the woodpile, the fence. Everything looked untouched. Yet he couldn't shake the sense of eyes in the dark. It began with the chickens, every last one gone. The coop door hung open, the hinges bent back like snapped bone. Feathers scattered across the dirt in place of tracks. No prints, no blood. Just absence. Roland's kind of message. Not a blow, but a warning, sharp enough to bleed slow. Myra found the ruin first. She crouched in the dirt, her hand trembling as she lifted a single broken feather. She didn't curse, didn't cry. She only let the wind take it from her palm. Lisa stood behind her, lips pressed tight. Nathan scanned the ridge with his jaw clenched. Ben kicked a loose board in frustration. Clara began to wail, too young, to understand but old enough to sense the danger pressing close. That night, Eli sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. Myra lit a lantern inside, the flame casting shadows that stretched long and restless. Neither spoke of it, but both knew the first cut had been made. A week later, it was the Shed behind the barn. Flames licked through dry wood before Eli even smelled the smoke. By the time he reached it, buckets in hand, the structure was half collapsed. Myra was already there, throwing water with practiced precision, her sleeves rolled high, her face set like stone. Nathan had dragged the little ones into the cellar the moment he saw smoke. By dawn, nothing remained but black beams and ash. Inside the cabin, nailed above Eli's bed, was a strip of Myra's apron. Torn, singed, tied in a bow. Below it, carved deep into the wood, 3 words, "She is mine." Eli stood for a long time staring at the mark. His jaw tightened. His hands didn't move. Myra came up behind him, her expression unreadable. "Do we leave?" she asked quietly. "No," Eli answered. "We make it clear we're not afraid." But fear wasn't the problem anymore. Anger was. A quiet, patient anger that sat in the bones and waited. Eli had fought for things before. Land, cattle, respect. But this time was different. This time it wasn't about property. It was about people. And he wasn't willing to lose. He started, fortifying the cabin. Not like a fortress, but like a haven that could withstand a storm. He moved the children's pallets closer to the hearth, where the walls were thickest. He cut new shutters, heavy with iron nails. Nathan stayed near the window with a hammer. Lisa tied bells to the back door with string so no one could slip in unnoticed. Ben began carrying a kitchen knife at his belt, his little hand clutching it like a soldier's. Myra didn't scold them. She didn't soften their edges. She taught them how to be careful without being afraid. 3 days passed, then 4. No sign of Roland until the letter came. Eli found it nailed to a tree near the edge of the property, folded parchment sealed in red wax like some gentleman's invitation. Inside, 4 lines written in a careful hand. "You made your choice." She made hers. The law is on my side. "I'll come when I please." No signature, just a thumbprint pressed in blood. Eli brought it back, laid it on the table. Myra read it once, then again. Her hands didn't shake. "He's bluffing," she said. "He won't bring lawmen. He won't risk their questions. He won't need them," Eli replied. "He'll bring men who wear law on their lips and vengeance in their boots." Myra folded the letter, fed it to the fire. The parchment curled black, then collapsed into ash. That night, Eli kept watch on the porch, lantern lit low. Scout prowled the clearing, hackles up, ears twitching at every whisper of wind. Myra didn't sleep. She sat by the hearth, one hand on Clara's back as the child shifted in uneasy dreams. The cabin walls felt too thin, the silence too brittle. Around midnight, the wind picked up. Scout growled once, low and sharp. Eli stepped onto the porch just as lanterns bobbed in the dark. 3 of them, weaving through the trees like fireflies with purpose. He didn't call out. He didn't move. Instead, he lit the signal torch by the barn. 3 bursts of flame climbing into the night. A warning Nathan knew to watch for. The plan had always been simple. Myra and the children would vanish into the root cellar beneath the pantry. Through the tunnel Eli had dug into the hillside, Eli would hold the line long enough for them to get clear. He told himself it wasn't about fighting, it was about buying time. But as he stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, his jaw set, his breath slow, Eli knew he wasn't moving. Not this time. The first man stepped into the clearing, not Roland, but one of his shadows. Tall, broad, a rifle slung careless across his back. The second followed, young, jittery, eyes darting. And then Roland himself, slow and steady, wearing that smile that was more poison than joy. "You really think you're going to stop me?" he called, voice carrying across the frost. Eli didn't answer. "You're a fool, Mercer. She's not worth dying for." The words hung in the air like smoke. And then, from the shadows behind the barn, Myra stepped out. She held Eli's old hunting rifle in her hands. Her stance was steady. Her eyes were iron. "Then come and find out," she said. Roland froze. Roland froze at the sound of her voice. His hand twitched near his coat, but he didn't draw. Not yet. "Myra," he said, smooth, coaxing, the tone of a man used to bending others by sound alone. "Don't point that at me. You don't know what you're doing." Her grip never wavered. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Roland's smile thinned. "Put the gun down. You think you scare me? You were always the one who—" The shot rang out before he could finish, a crack that split the night echoing through the pines. She hadn't aimed to kill. Her bullet bit into the dirt a foot from his boots. The younger man yelped, dropping his rifle and bolting for the trees. The taller one cursed, hesitated, then turned and followed. Roland stood alone. "You wouldn't," he sneered, though his voice faltered. "I just did," Myra said. Eli stepped forward, the shotgun heavy in his hands. "You've got nothing left here," he told Roland. The man's eyes flicked between them, fury simmering. "You think she'll stay with you? You think this place is home?" Myra's voice was cold, sharp as glass. "It's more home than you ever gave me." Roland's jaw worked, but he didn't move closer. Not when Eli raised his weapon higher. Not when Myra's finger tightened on the trigger again. "Go," she said, each word deliberate. "Before I decide you don't leave standing." For a long moment, Roland's pride wrestled with his fear. Then, with a bitter laugh that held no humor, he turned, mounted his horse, and vanished into the night. Only when the last sound of hooves had faded did Myra lower the rifle. Eli exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then glanced at her. "You weren't supposed to come out," he said. "I know. I could have handled it. I know." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Eli saw something new in her. Not just defiance, not just exhaustion. Choice. She had chosen to stand beside him, not behind him. When they returned inside, the children crept from the cellar. Nathan clutched the revolver Eli had given him, jaw tight but eyes wide. Lisa carried Clara, whispering reassurance against the girl's hair. Ben's small fists trembled as he gripped his knife. Tommy clung to Lisa's skirt, silent but shaking. Myra knelt, gathering them close. Eli stood back, watching as they buried themselves in her arms. And in that moment, he realized something final. This wasn't his cabin anymore. It was theirs. But peace didn't follow. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath in the days after. No birds sang. No wind stirred the trees. Even the creek behind the barn flowed too quiet, as if waiting. Eli moved through the days with the awareness of a man who knew peace was temporary, who counted blessings while waiting for the toil. He worked harder, fixed the barn roof, stacked wood higher, checked the locks twice before nightfall. Myra, though, changed again. Not outwardly. She still moved with the same careful precision, still watched the horizon when she thought no one noticed. But Eli saw it in the small things, the way her hand lingered on Clara's curls a moment longer, the way her gaze drifted toward the ridge at dawn, as if bracing for what came next. She never asked if Roland was gone for good. Eli never promised he was. But they began to live again, if only in small ways. Nathan built a wooden box for kindling, carving careful lines along the edges. Lisa planted beans by the back fence, her hands in the dirt, her face intent. Ben found a broken harmonica in one of Eli's drawers and carried it everywhere, playing breathy, sour tunes that somehow filled the cabin with life. Tommy followed Myra like a shadow, clutching her skirts. Bright Clara, laughed for the first time in weeks. Even Myra allowed herself to soften. She stopped keeping her satchel by the door. She let herself linger at the table after meals. She began stitching a quilt from scraps of flannel, piecing together mismatched colors into something whole. And Eli found himself making room, fixing shelves for her things, patching boots without being asked, building small comforts he'd never thought to build for himself. Still, unease lingered. One Sunday, as the children played near the stream and Myra scrubbed laundry at the water's edge, Scout barked sharp and urgent. Eli dropped his hammer and turned toward the ridge. Nothing moved. No rider, no sound. Just silence. But that night, Scout paced the cabin, circling again and again, ears perked, tail rigid. Myra sat by the fire with the rifle in her lap. Eli didn't argue. He pulled up a chair beside her, poured bitter coffee into 2 tin cups, and kept watch. Until dawn. "You think it's him?" she asked. "I think he's not far," Eli said. "And I think he's waiting for us to get comfortable." She stared into the flames. "He'll try something different next time." Eli's jaw clenched. He won't get the chance. But even as he said it, he felt the truth in her silence. Roland wasn't gone. He was circling, waiting, and the storm he carried had only just begun. The letter didn't come nailed to a tree this time. It came delivered. Late afternoon, a man rode up the trail, not one of Roland's shadows. This one was clean-shaven, tidy coat, polite voice. He dismounted with the ease of someone who didn't fear the woods. Eli stepped onto the porch before he could knock. "You Mercer?" the man asked. "I am. I represent the county registrar, here on legal business." His tone was courteous, but too smooth, too rehearsed. He removed his hat. "I need to speak with a Mrs. Myra Jansen." Myra appeared in the doorway, her expression cautious. "What business?" The man glanced at her, then back at Eli. "Your husband has petitioned the court, filed for custody of the children, claims abandonment and mental instability." Myra's lips parted, then curled into a bitter smile. "Instability. He broke my arm." The man didn't blink. "Do you have proof?" Eli stepped forward, his stance making the porch boards creak. "You can leave now." The man adjusted his hat, unfazed. "The hearing will be held 2 weeks from now. If you don't attend, it'll be decided without you." He left a sealed envelope on the railing, then mounted and rode off at a measured pace, as if the whole matter were already concluded. Eli watched until the rider vanished over the ridge. Myra picked up the envelope, stared at the neat script, then carried it inside. Without breaking the seal, she dropped it into the fire. The wax hissed, the parchment curled, and the words meant to undo her turned black in the flames. But it changed things, not because she believed the law would side with Roland, but because she knew it could. That night, she sat by the fire, her children asleep nearby, and said quietly, "I have no documents, no papers, no birth records, nothing but names and my word. That's enough for me," Eli said. Her eyes met his. "But it won't be, for them." Eli had no answer. He was a man who had lived outside of papers, outside of signatures. He didn't understand a world where family had to be proven. So Myra made a decision. "We need to speak to the Reverend," she said. "He knew me, knew Roland. He might not stand for me, but he won't lie for him either." 2 mornings later, before dawn, Eli hitched the wagon. Myra wore her one. Good dress, pressed clean. Lisa held Clara close. Nathan kept the rifle across his lap, and the younger boys sat in silence, eyes wide. Ren Valley looked smaller than Eli remembered. Narrow streets, tired buildings leaning inward as though listening. People watched as they passed, whispers following like dust. The Reverend was an old man, thin, his eyes pale and unclouded. He remembered Myra too well. He remembered Roland too. When she asked if he'd speak truth if called upon, he gave a single nod. "I don't meddle in family business," he said. "But I won't lie." It was more than she'd hoped. On their way back through town, they stopped for supplies. Myra took the children to the feed store while Eli went for flour. That's when Roland stepped out from between 2 buildings. He looked scrubbed clean, shaven, his clothes sharp. The kind of man who could pass for respectable if you didn't know the truth. He smiled like they were old friends. I'm glad you came, Roland said. Eli didn't move. They'll take my side, Roland went on smoothly. They always do, especially when the woman can't even sign her own name proper. Eli's fist struck before he thought. One hard blow, years of anger behind it. Roland staggered, blood spilling from his nose, but he didn't strike back. He just wiped his face and smiled through red teeth. You'll see, he whispered. The law is slow, but it doesn't forget. A few townsfolk had gathered, eyes wide, but none stepped in. Eli turned his back, gathered his supplies, and walked away. They rode home in silence. The children fidgeted, sensing the shift. Myra sat rigid, her jaw set. Only when they reached the ridge did she finally speak. I'm not afraid of losing them, she said softly. Eli turned his head. I'm afraid of what I'll become to keep them. You won't become anything you're not already, Eli answered gently. She didn't reply, but when they reached the cabin, she stood on the porch long after the children went inside, gripping the railing as though it held her upright. Eli joined her, silent, watching the dark stretch endless before them. They both knew Roland hadn't played his final hand, not yet. The summons came wrapped in wax, the kind of official seal meant to intimidate. A stage courier delivered it at dawn, folding cream vellum like it carried the weight of gospel. Myra held it in her hands by the fire, her eyes locked on the sharp letters, reading and rereading as though they might change. But they didn't. County Court, Eli read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. 3 days' ride south. Roland's name inked bold, the petition beneath it. The hearing was set. Myra's hands trembled, but not with fear, with fury. The judge will listen to him, she whispered. They'll nod, they'll believe. They always do. Eli set a hand over hers, grounding her. Then we give them something better to believe. She looked at him sharply. And if they take them? They won't. But she knew as well as he did. Law didn't bend for the poor, and Roland had learned to wear respectability like a mask. 2 days later, before first light, Eli hitched the wagon. Myra wore her dress pressed flat, her braid pulled tight. The children clustered by the door. Ben clung to her skirt. Clara sobbed into her shoulder. Nathan stood stiff and silent, eyes blazing. I'll bring her back, Eli told them, steady as stone. All of them, I swear it. The journey south stretched long. Hills gave way to plains, snow giving ground to thaw. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. Myra's hand rested in Eli's lap, silent, steady. Her silence was no longer fear. It was resolve. They reached the courthouse. By dusk on the third day, a whitewashed building, tall columns chipped with age, the paint curling like old paper. Men loitered on the steps, smoking, muttering. The clerk waved them through without raising his eyes. Inside, the air smelled of dust and sweat. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of onlookers. The judge was an older man with pale eyes that carried the fatigue of years. He sat behind the bench, like stone carved from stone. Roland was already there, clean-shaven, suit pressed. His expression a mask of patient grief. He looked every inch the man wronged. The hearing began. Questions rose and fell. Roland's witnesses stood. A banker swearing Myra abandoned her accounts. A cousin who had never met the children but vouched for Roland's steady character. Their words slid smooth, rehearsed, practiced lies that played well in rooms like this. Then Roland himself spoke. His voice carried calm conviction. She left without reason, took my children. I searched for years. I only want what is mine, my wife, my family. Eli's fists curled beneath the table. Myra's face didn't move. Finally, the judge turned. Mrs. Jansen, do you wish to speak? The room fell still. Myra rose, not with hesitation, but with the weight of a woman who had been silent too long. Her voice was low but clear. "My children are not property," she said, "and I was never yours." The crowd stirred, whispers slicing the silence. "I fled with bruises," she went on, her voice steady. "I fled because my oldest son begged me to. Because he saw what kind of man you were before I could shield him. Because my daughter cried when you entered a room." She turned to the judge, her gaze unflinching. "I have no papers, no money, but I have their trust, their love. I never abandoned them. I saved them." She sat. The courtroom hung suspended in quiet, as though the walls themselves had heard truth spoken for the first time in years. The judge leaned back, eyes unreadable. He did not pass judgment. He only said, "A written decision will be delivered within the week." And then he dismissed them. Outside, the air was sharp and too still. Myra clutched her shawl tighter, her face pale but resolute. They walked to the wagon in silence. On the ride north, she didn't speak. Eli didn't press her. Only when the ridge of their cabin came into view did her breath hitch. Smoke curled soft from the chimney. Home. But the porch told another story. Something dangled from the doorframe. A doll, Clara's doll, torn, stained, nailed into the wood like a warning. Myra gasped, leaping from the wagon before the horses even stopped. She tore it down with trembling hands, pressing it to her chest. Inside, nothing was broken, but nothing was whole either. The cellar door gaped wide, the food stores untouched. On the table, scrawled in chalk, 3 words, "You lose." The house was empty. No Nathan, no Lisa, no Ben, no Tommy, no Clara. Eli's knees buckled, his breath shattering. Myra stood rigid, the doll clutched in her hands, her voice cracking into a single word. Where? Eli forced himself to think, forced his mind through the haze of panic. He closed his eyes, recalled Roland's haunts, his kin. And then, it struck him. South. Ridge, past the split in the creek. Roland's cousin's hunting cabin, empty, remote, no eyes, no law. "Myra," he began, but she was already moving, untying the horse, her face pale with fire. Eli followed. They rode into the night, hooves drumming, no words between them. Only fury, only fear, and a hollow, waiting in the dark. The cabin sat in a hollow, crouched low among the pines. Small, dark, quiet, too quiet. The moon had just cleared the ridge when Eli reined in his horse. Myra didn't wait for him. She slid from the saddle, her boots sinking into the wet earth. In one hand, she clutched Clara's doll. In the other, the knife Eli had given her years before when they first patched fences together. Eli moved ahead, rifle raised. The air smelled of wood smoke and rot. He heard it then, a muffled cry, faint but sharp enough to slice through the night. They crept closer. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Eli motioned her back, but Myra shook her head, refusing. Together, they pushed inside. The room smelled of liquor and damp wood. The fire in the hearth burned low, shadows flickering across the walls. In one corner, the children huddled tight. Ropes hung loose around their wrists, untied but left as reminders. Nathan stood in front of them like a shield, his small body rigid, his face pale. Roland sat slouched in a chair opposite, glass in hand, pistol near his boot. His eyes gleamed mean under the dim light. "You came," he drawled, voice slurred with drink. Myra stepped forward, her jaw set. Roland raised his glass in mock salute. "Cheers to the end." She didn't flinch. She dropped the doll at his feet. The tiny, ragged body hit the dirt floor with a soft thud, louder in the silence than a gunshot. Then she stooped, picked up the pistol by his boot before he could move, and leveled it steady in her hand. "Time to go," she told the children. Her voice was calm, flat, absolute. Nathan didn't hesitate. He herded the others past her, his hand brushing Eli's for the briefest second, a silent acknowledgement. Ben carried Tommy. Lisa clutched. Clara, whispering that Mama was here. Mama was real. Roland laughed, the sound jagged and broken. You think this is over, girl? You think he'll keep you? You think these brats will save you? Myra turned her back to him. You're finished, Roland. Look at you, he sneered. Acting like you've got power. You'll never… The hammer clicked beneath her thumb. The sound froze him mid-sentence. For the first time, Eli saw it. The shift in Roland's face. Not pride, not rage. Fear. Myra lowered the pistol just enough to make her point. Stay here. Drink yourself to death. But if you ever come near us again, you won't leave breathing. Eli's hand brushed her arm gently. Come on. They didn't look back. They walked out into the night, the children clustering close, the forest swallowing the sound of Roland's hollow laughter. The ride home was long, dawn bleeding gray into the horizon. Lisa refused to let go of Myra's hand. Clara slept in Eli's arms, her small chest rising and falling steady against his coat. Ben cried silently, his tears streaking dirt across his cheeks. Nathan rode upright, barefoot but unbroken, his gaze fixed forward. When they reached the cabin, Myra collapsed onto the floor just inside the door. The pistol clattered from her hand, the doll still clutched in her fist. For the first time since Eli had known her, she wept. Not the quiet, muffled grief she hid at night, but deep, shaking sobs that broke through the silence of the cabin walls. Eli didn't speak. He only knelt beside her, his hand steady on her back, his own eyes burning. For the first time in years, he wept too, not out of pain, but out of relief. It was over. Or at least this part was. The days that followed didn't pass like time. They passed like healing. Uneven, crooked, never in a straight line. The cabin, once a place of solitude, grew into something else. Not just four walls against weather, but a beginning. Nathan kept watch at the porch with Scout by his side. Lisa took to cooking small meals, portioning food carefully, her sharp eyes softening just a little each day. Ben wandered the yard with his harmonica, the broken notes carrying strange comfort. Tommy clung to Myra, his small hand gripping her skirts. And Clara, bright-eyed Clara, laughed again, chasing fireflies in the dusk. Myra rose each morning with the dawn now. Not to pack, not to plan an escape, but to work. She hung quilts on the line. She washed dishes in the creek. She stitched Clara's doll back together with thread unraveled from one of Eli's old shirts. Piece by piece, she reclaimed herself. Eli built. Quiet, steady, deliberate. A shelf above the hearth for Myra's keepsakes. A pen behind the barn. For goats. Repairs on the chicken coop. He wasn't building just for himself anymore. He was building for them. Sometimes he'd catch Myra watching him, her expression unreadable, her eyes dark with something deeper than gratitude. She no longer carried her satchel to the door. She no longer kept her boots laced for running. She stayed. And though Roland's shadow lingered in their thoughts, though none of them said his name aloud, the hollow he left behind was not filled with fear. It was filled with something harder, stronger. Family. For a while, the days slipped into a rhythm. Work, meals, laughter that sounded hesitant at first, then truer with each passing week. It might have been mistaken for peace, if not for the weight that lingered in Eli's chest each night when he checked the locks, when Scout growled at nothing, when Myra's eyes wandered the ridge before dawn. They both knew Roland wasn't gone. He was circling. The proof arrived on a Sunday. The children were down at the stream, their shouts carrying back up the hill. Myra was waist-deep in laundry, sleeves rolled, her hands raw from soap. Eli was patching the roof when Scout barked once, sharp, urgent. Eli dropped his hammer. The forest stood still, too still. No rider, no sound, but the air was heavy, the kind that made skin prickle. That night, Scout wouldn't rest. He paced the cabin, ears twitching, tail rigid. Myra sat by the fire with the rifle laid across her lap. Eli didn't argue. He pulled a chair beside her, poured 2 cups of bitter coffee, and watched the dark. "You think it's him?" she asked. "I know it is," Eli said. "He'll try something different next time." Eli nodded grimly. "Then we'll be ready." The next day, a rider did come. Not Roland. Another stranger, dressed neat, coat buttoned, polite like the registrar's man before. He dismounted. With a smile, offered a slip of paper. "From the county," he said smoothly. "Custodial matter. Judge set a new date. You're expected." Myra stepped forward. "What law?" "Your husband has filed again," the man replied. "Claims abandonment, claims you're unfit. The court will decide." Myra's laughter was sharp, bitter. "Unfit? I kept them alive when he wouldn't feed them." "Do you have proof?" the man asked blandly. Eli's hand tightened around the porch rail. "You've said enough." The rider tipped his hat. "Be wise to attend, or the judgment will be made without you." When he left, dust trailing behind his horse, Myra turned to Eli, her face pale but steady. "We have no papers, no records, nothing but what we are." "That's enough," Eli said. Her voice dropped low. "It won't be." That night she whispered her plan. "The Reverend. He knew Roland. He knew me. He won't lie if they call on him." Eli hesitated. "If Roland's still nearby, he already knows where I am," she said simply. 2 mornings later they set out again. The wagon rattled down the narrow trail, the children bundled in quilts. Myra sat stiff beside Eli, her braid tight, her jaw set. Ren Valley felt smaller than ever, its streets lined with whispering eyes. The Reverend remembered. He remembered her bruises. He remembered Roland's temper. When she asked if he would testify truthfully, he nodded once. "I don't meddle in family business," he said, "but I'll tell the truth." It was enough. Not a promise of safety, but a sliver of hope. On the way back, they stopped for supplies. Myra led the children into the feed store. Eli crossed the street for flour. That's when Roland appeared. He stepped from the alley like he'd been waiting all along, clean-shaven, dressed fine, his smile polished to a sheen. "I was hoping we'd run into each other," he said. Eli's hand curled into a fist. "You know how this ends," Roland went on. "The law will side with me. It always does, especially when the woman can't even read her own name." The words snapped something inside Eli. His fist struck before thought. One hard blow that sent Roland reeling, blood spilling down his face. Roland didn't strike back. He just smiled through red teeth. "You'll see. The law doesn't forget." Townfolk had gathered, eyes wide, whispering. Eli turned, gathered his supplies, and walked back to the wagon. Myra met his eyes as he climbed up. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. They rode home in silence. The ridge came into sight, smoke rising soft from the chimney. For a moment, Eli let himself breathe. But the porch told another story. Nailed to the doorframe was Clara's doll again, torn, singed, its stitched smile twisted. Myra tore it down with a choked cry, clutching it to her chest. Inside, the cellar door hung open, food stores untouched. On the table, scrawled in chalk, 3 words, "You lose." The children were gone. Nathan, Lisa, Ben, Tommy, Clara. No signs of struggle, no footprints, just absence. Eli's knees buckled. Myra's voice broke into a whisper, one word tearing from her lips like blood. "Where?" Eli closed his eyes, thought hard. Roland's kin, his old haunts. Then he knew. South Ridge, the hunting cabin, remote, empty, no law. When Eli turned, Myra was already at the horse, tightening the saddle straps with shaking hands. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Together they rode into the night, chasing the hollow Roland had left behind. The trail to South Ridge wound like a scar through the hills, narrowing to stone before it opened into the hollow. By the time Eli and Myra reached it, the sky was paling at the edges, dawn pressing against the night. Their horses steamed, their bodies aching, but neither slowed. The children were close. Eli could feel it in the weight of the silence, in the way Myra's eyes burned forward like lanterns fixed on a single point. The cabin appeared at the far end of the clearing, small and crooked, leaning like an old drunk. No smoke curled from its chimney. No sound drifted from within. Too quiet. Eli dismounted, motioning Myra to stay back. She ignored him, sliding down with Clara's doll still clutched in her hand, the knife strapped to her belt. He tested. The ground, rifle raised. The door was cracked open, the faint smell of liquor seeping through. And then he heard it. A muffled sob. He kicked the door wide. The children huddled in the corner, eyes wide, pale faces streaked with dirt. Nathan stood in front of them like a wall, his jaw set, his fists clenched, though he had nothing but his body to shield them. Lisa held Clara close, whispering promises that Mama was coming. Ben's hands shook around a stick he'd found, his eyes blazing with defiance. Tommy pressed his face into Lisa's skirt. Roland sat opposite, slouched in a chair. A bottle dangled from his hand, the pistol lying careless at his boot. He looked up slowly, his grin crooked, eyes red from drink. "You came," he slurred, lifting the bottle. "Knew you would." Myra stepped past Eli before he could stop her. She dropped the doll at Roland's feet. The sound of it hitting the floor was sharper than a gunshot. Roland sneered. "Always dramatic. Thought you'd bring chains this time?" Myra bent, lifted the pistol from the floor, and leveled it at him. Her hands didn't shake. "Get up," she said. Roland laughed. "You won't shoot me. You never had it in you." Eli spoke quietly from behind her. "She's not the same woman you left bleeding." For the first time, Roland's smile faltered. Myra's eyes didn't leave his. "I kept these children alive when you would have let them starve. I carried them through winters, through hunger, through fear. And I'll carry them past you." She gestured with the pistol. "Move." Nathan guided his siblings past her, their small feet quick, their breaths sharp. Eli held the door as they slipped out one by one, his hand brushing Nathan's shoulder in silent pride. Roland rose slowly, testing her resolve. His smile returned, weaker this time. But there. "You think this ends because you walk out? You think he'll keep you when he realizes what you are? Broken. Used. Nothing." Myra's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Better broken and free than whole and chained." For a moment, the air held still. Roland's hand twitched near his belt. Myra cocked the hammer. The sound cracked like thunder. Roland froze. His eyes searched hers for fear and found none. Only finality. Eli's voice was low, steady. "You won't follow." Roland's jaw clenched. He spat to the side, then sank back into his chair, the bottle tipping, spilling liquor across the floor. He waved a hand like he was dismissing them. "Go then. Run. It won't matter. The world's bigger than your little patch of dirt. I'll always be out there." But even as he said it, his voice was hollow. Myra lowered the pistol just enough to make her choice clear. "Stay here. Rot. But if you come again, you won't leave." She turned, her back to him, and walked out the door. The children clung to her in the clearing, their arms wrapping tight. Eli ushered them toward the wagon. He looked back once, just once, and saw Roland slumped in shadow, the fire dying to ash. They rode hard for home, the sun rising at their backs. By the time the cabin came into view, the children were half asleep, leaning against each other, their small bodies exhausted, but safe. Inside, Myra collapsed by the hearth, Clara's curls tangled in her fingers. Eli stoked the fire, his hands shaking only now that it was over. It was finished. At least this part. The days that followed felt like repair. Nathan helped Eli mend fences. Lisa kept the meals steady. Ben carried his harmonica everywhere, blowing sour notes that still filled the room with warmth. Tommy shadowed Myra's steps. Clara laughed in her sleep. And Myra herself changed once more. She no longer carried her satchel to the door. She no longer braided her hair tight as armor. She stayed. She stitched quilts, planted beans, rebuilt the chicken coop with Eli's tools. And every night, when the fire burned low, she rested without fear of footsteps at the door. Eli realized something then, something quiet but permanent. The cabin was no longer his alone. It was theirs. A place no law, no man, no shadow could take. Roland had lost. Not in the court, not by the gun, but in the only way that mattered. He no longer owned her fear. And sometimes, Eli thought, that was the truest victory of all. Eli sat back, the weight of the years heavy in his chest. Myra's voice was steady, not pleading, not fragile, just firm with resolve. "Papers for the children," she said. "If something happens to me, I want their names protected. I want this place to be theirs." Eli nodded. Of course. But Myra didn't stop there. Her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl, her gaze dropping to her lap before she lifted her chin again. "I want to change my name." Eli's breath caught. "To what?" She held his gaze without wavering. "To Myra Mercer." For a moment, the silence felt alive. Eli rose slowly, crossed the small space between them, and knelt at her side. His voice was rough with emotion he hadn't spoken in years. "You don't need to take my name." "I know," she said softly, "but I want it. Not because I belong to you, because I don't belong to him, not anymore." Eli didn't touch her, didn't press his hand over hers. He only sat beside her, his jaw tight, his heart steadying as though the words themselves had stitched something back together inside him. For the first time since the knock that brought her into his life, Eli Mercer smiled. The next morning, they rode to town, not with fear, not with desperation, but with purpose. At the courthouse, Myra signed the form with a hand that didn't tremble. "Mercer, huh?" the clerk asked, raising an eyebrow. Myra nodded once. "That's right." The clerk stamped it without ceremony. "Well, Mrs. Mercer, welcome to Ren County." It wasn't a wedding. There were no vows whispered under candlelight, no preacher's words, no rings to bind them. But as Myra held the signed paper, her fingers brushed the ink with reverence deeper than any ceremony. It wasn't about Eli directly. It was about herself. About becoming something more than what had been done to her. A woman who chose, who claimed, who named her own future. When they returned to the cabin, Scout barked his welcome. Nathan dragged a broken chair into the yard and demanded Eli's help fixing it. Lisa was showing Clara how to braid grass into crowns. Ben ran forward with a splinter in his thumb, insisting only Myra could remove it. Tommy came last, holding out a jar with a beetle inside, grinning as he declared he'd caught a marshal. The porch smelled of pine and baking bread. The air was clear. For the first time, Myra Mercer stepped into her home. Not as a fugitive, not as a guest, but as the woman who owned it. Weeks passed. A rhythm took shape. Not the same rhythm they had survived before, but a stronger one. Myra taught the children to preserve berries for winter. Eli showed Nathan how to build a windbreak to hold against storms. Lisa read aloud to Clara by lamplight. Ben practiced whistling, terrible but proud. Tommy trailed Myra, repeating everything she said as though her words themselves were lessons.